Thank you all for coming so much to this lecture on the CarrollCloar exhibition in conjunction with the exhibition over at the Arkansas Art Center. My name is Greg Thompson, and I'm an art dealer and a consultant here in Little Rock and have been in business since 1995. I first became aware of CarrollCloar about 18 years ago. I was talking to a really good client of mine and said, "Would you like to buy a Roller Wilson?" And he said, "Come by my office, let me take a look at the photograph." And I did, and he said, "Do you know anything about CarrollCloar?" And I said, "I've never heard of him." And he said, "Well, let me tell you about Cloar." And 2 hours later, I was still in his office and still transfixed. He had introduced me to something that I never knew existed, and I've been in love with ever since. So let's talk a little about this Arkansas and Tennessee legend. CarrollCloar grew up in Earl, Arkansas. Has anybody ever been to Earl? There we go, yeah. You know, it's the Arkansas Delta. It's farmland. It's agricultural. Not a lot of cultural things going on in Earl, other than, you know, some tractors and maybe a square dance or two and a revival tent. And Cloar really felt like an alien child. He was in that funny age bracket. He had a sister who passed away before him and a brother after, and really didn't have, he had some siblings, but none of them were the same age, so he really didn't have anybody to play with. And he kind of felt like a fish out of water in Earl. He knew he was for bigger things. He was interested in more things other than hoeing soybeans and rice and cotton. And he wasn't too terribly close to his parents. He really didn't have a lot in common with them. This is his father, Charles Wesley Cloar, about 1955. And he said, "My father didn't feel dressed in the morning unless he had his Colt 45 around his waist," and that was true. I mean, you know, 1955 in Earl, Arkansas, you know, you had to carry a gun. And this is kind of how Cloar saw his father, himself, and his environment in Earl. "My father was as big as a tree." This is in the permanent collection of the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art. This is an early casein tempera painting. And for you all who don't know what casein tempera is, it is a media that goes back to the cave paintings. The media is a milk protein, and the binding agent is egg yolks. And they've been using it forever, big in the Renaissance. And Cloar discovered this media when he was in New York in the 1950s. But this is a perfect example of a CarrollCloar-esque painting. It's got everything in it. It's got rural Arkansas. It's got a touch of surrealism. You know, his father is as big as a tree. And here's Carroll, an isolated little boy in a toy car. You know, this speaks volumes about how CarrollCloar saw his world. This is his mother. She was a saintly lass from Earl. She loved the church. You know, she loved going to church, you know, 3 or 4 times a week and studying the Bible, being in the choir. And remember, this is a small town. In a church congregation, you've probably got half as many people are in this room right now. Religion was very important to her. She wanted Cloar to be a preacher, and they had a go at it when he was a kid, and he didn't want anything to do with it. He wanted to be a cowboy. He wanted to read. He wanted to be an artist. You know, he wanted to be a painter. So this is CarrollCloar at about 10 years old in Earl, Arkansas. And remember this image, because this is really how Cloar sees himself through his entire life, as a cowboy. And this is a great little painting from 1980, and I'm kind of fast forwarding with, you know, the images, but this is called The Cowboy. One of Cloar's closest friends and companions was a little girl named Charlie May. And Charlie May was from a black family who lived on the other side of the pasture. And they were quick friends. You know, Carroll didn't have affiliations with anybody, and he said, if anybody would be my friend, you know, he wasn't needy or anything, but they were soulmates. You know, they both had a rich imagination. They both liked to tell stories and pretend that there were panthers and ghouls and stuff in the forest. And this is one of my favorite paintings. This is called What Charlie May Dreamt. Once again, quintessential Cloar. You know, we have southern Arkansas, we have Tennessee, and we have almost this surrealist take on the rural America, where you've got Charlie May and Carroll eating watermelons with a panther, and some talking raccoons and some talking bunnies. Yeah, this is quintessential CarrollCloar. Let's talk about his education and influences, because as we all know, our influences and the people we hang around with are everything. CarrollCloar's mother died pretty early in life, and as all good Southern couples, CarrollCloar's father soon followed. They were madly in love, they couldn't live without each other, and they both died. Well, Cloar and his siblings inherited the family farm and the estate, and he took his inheritance, and he got the hell out of Earl, Arkansas. Cloar goes to neighboring Memphis and enrolls in Southwestern in the 1930s. And even when he was at Earl, he doodled, he did little cartoons and sketches. And this is one of the pieces he did for the playbill in Southwestern in 1930. And this is really what CarrollCloar wanted to be. He wanted to be a cartoonist. And he was very athletic. He was a strapping lad. He was on the football team. He was on the track team. He was a member of a fraternity. He blossomed at Southwestern. Well, after he graduated from Southwestern, he had a pretty good, inheritance from the farm. He did what a lot of college students did. He went to Europe, and he had a ball. And he studied all of the masters and all the painters and all the churches and the temples that he had seen at Rhodes. He saw it all firsthand and really soaked it all up. And of course, art was at the forefront of that experience. When Cloar comes back to the United States, he gets as far away from Memphis as humanly possible. Where does he go? Where any promising artist goes, New York. He loved it. He would go to baseball games, he would go to museums, he would go to restaurants, hang out at Coney Island. He just soaked it all up. And all of this was an influence on how Cloar saw the world, the things he learned about artists and media and technique. And he was trying to make a go of it as a cartoonist. And we do these kind of, funky little cartoons. But thank God the rubber never hit the road for CarrollCloar in cartoonism. What CarrollCloar did when he finally said, I want to get serious about it, being an artist, he went where every artist goes in the United States of America if they're serious about being an artist. He went to the Art Students League. It's one of the most oldest established colleges in America, and all the greats have either taught there or gone there. George O'Keeffe, Thomas Hart Benton, Jackson Pollock, Ben Shahn, Robert Henry. It is a bedrock of art, culture, media. It's where you go to soak it all up. And he was there for 4 years. This is a wonderful lithograph, and he gets into lithography at the Art Students League. And he starts hanging out with a guy named Will Barnett. Does everybody know who Will Barnett is? A master lithographer. They were about the same age. And this is a lithograph that he did called The Ingredients. And as you can see, you've got the delta way back in the back. You've got some of his professors at Southwestern, and you've got some of his art professors here at the Students League. So Cloar really rockets to stardom. The fuse is lit with this lithograph. Does anybody know what was happening in 1939 in New York? The World's Fair. And the World's Fair wanted something. The thing about the World's Fair is they want examples from the country. What does America really look like? And somebody, of course, went to the Art Students League and found this lithograph. So Cloar exhibits at the World's Fair, and also is a popcorn vendor there to get a little bit more money. But it's this lithograph that really ignites his career. So fame, fellowships, and travel. Like any budding good artist who's going to go somewhere and is serious about a career, fellowships are everything. First fellowship he gets is a McDowell Traveling Fellowship, and he goes to Mexico. Why Mexico? He gets to be a cowboy. So this is Carroll in Mexico. He's got his cowboy boots on. He's got, his nice duds. He's hanging out, in the courtyard. Unfortunately, World War II happens, and Carroll is drafted into the Pacific. But what does he do? He's painting pinup girls on bombers, and he was probably pretty good at it. When World War II is over, he gets a Guggenheim Fellowship, and this time he goes further south. He goes into South America. While in South America and while in Mexico, two things happen to Carroll artistically. He studies the Mexican muralists like Diego Rivera, which you can definitely see the influence in this drawing, even though it's from 1969, and this is in our show, A Road Less Traveled. I encourage you to take a look at it. But something else happens to Carroll. In Mexico and South America, unlike the United States, they think nothing of painting a house pink, or turquoise, or purple, or chartreuse. The Latin American culture likes to spice things up any way they can. And Cloar is really moved by this and is influenced by this dramatic colorization. This is a piece that he did in 1951 called The Windy Corner in Veracruz, and is very quintessential Cloar for a lot of reasons. You've got a building, you've got a structure, and you've got people, and you've got a narrative. And narrative was very important to Cloar. He was an English major at Southwestern and almost became a writer. Speaking of which, the gasoline that gets ignited by the fuse from the World's Fair is this. Life magazine, as some of you may know, was the magazine to read in the United States. It was on every coffee table, every barber shop, every newsstand. Everybody in America read this magazine as a nod to what's hip, what's new, what's going on in life. And CarrollCloar got a 4-page spread in this magazine called My Backwoods Boyhood in 1949. So Cloar moves back to New York and starts using egg tempera, and we talked a little bit about that. And at the same time, Ben Shahn, does anybody know who Ben Shahn is? Ben Shahn was a fellow painter who was at the Art Students League, who had been to Earl, Arkansas before in a WPA grant, and the two knew each other. And what happens when he goes back to New York is Ben Shahn is having his first one-man show at the Museum of Art, at MoMA. And Cloar is really taken with this exhibition. There are things in Ben Shahn's work that really speak to Cloar, and this is one of Shahn's paintings. Of course, the almost cartoon caricature-like treatment of the figures, the flatness, the buildings, the tempera paint. But also, Shahn is also a narrative artist and very much a social agenda. What's going on in the world? I don't want to make pretty pictures. I want to talk about civil rights, and I want to talk about what's going on in Uruguay and injustices in New York and communism. So there was a narrative to Shahn's work. The next thing that happens that takes Cloar into the air is Edith Halpert. Edith Halpert, does anybody know who Edith was? She was the first female gallerist in the United States to represent American artists. At the turn of the century, when Edith gets involved, Americans were buying European art. They were buying Degas, they were buying Picasso, they were buying Monet, they were buying what was hip and cool. Edith stepped out and said, "What about our own?" And she had some big kahunas for a little Jewish woman. And she stepped out and she made a name for herself, and she cut her own swath in New York, which was a man's world back then. And this is another article that came out in Life magazine, once again, some of the fuel that rockets CarrollCloar into stardom, with Edith talking about her new proteges. And she has CarrollCloar, and she has Ben Shahn, and she has some other artists, along with her very established artists on the bottom to kind of give it some, some credibility. We got Jacob Lawrence. We have Charles Sheeler, the bedrock that we see in the museums now. Cloar was only showing his South American pieces with Edith, but she was selling them. And who was buying them? A collector named Joseph H. Hirshhorn. Does everybody know who he is? So Hirshhorn is one of the first clients of Edith's to really see the genius in CarrollCloar and starts buying a lot of them. I think he bought a dozen during his buying frenzy with Cloar, and several of them were at the show at the Arkansas Art Center. But what really cinches it is Abby Rockefeller was also one of Edith's best clients. And just like Joseph Hirshhorn, people like to keep up with the Joneses. What is Mr. Hirshhorn buying? CarrollCloar? I think I need to take a look at this artist. This is the one that Mrs. Rockefeller bought, called The Playground Edge, 1956. A very whimsical girl playing on the jungle gems. And of course, we all know what happens with Miss Rockefeller. She decides to open a little museum called the Museum of Modern Art. She's on the board. She's very influential. So guess who's buying a CarrollCloar? The Museum of Modern Art. This is a piece that MoMA bought shortly thereafter, in 1953. And then it just becomes a domino effect. The Whitney gets a piece, the Metropolitan gets a piece, the Smithsonian gets a piece, and CarrollCloar is off to the races. And he went with a gallery named the Allen Gallery, who was a close collaborator of Edith. This is a piece in the Metropolitan's collection, which is in the Arkansas Art Center show right now, called The Lightning That Struck Rutheth Barcliff. And once again, we've got this kind of cornball take on life in the Delta, He's about to chop down a tree and he gets struck by lightning and it hits him right in the head. And Carroll thinks this is funny. And Carroll wants to make a painting about this. At the Allen Gallery, Cloar could do no wrong. He was getting purchased by everybody. This, of course, is another piece from the Hirshhorn collection, which is also in the Arkansas Art Center show. Cloar would use for his inspiration old family albums, photographs. And this is a photograph in his family album from 1928, which was the impetus for that painting. So the Allen Gallery, and where there's smoke, there's fire. And Hollywood elites start collecting Cloar's work. Here's a piece that Jack Lemmon purchased for his collection. Here's a piece that Diana Shore purchased for her collection. Very influential woman in the 60s and 70s. So now he's got, these very influential people buying his work. And what does Carroll do? Carroll does something that very few artists have ever done in the history of art. He's hitting home runs there in New York, but he says, you know what? I'm not happy with this anymore. I think I'm going to go back to my home, back to the South. And at the height of his career, he moves back to Memphis. Buys a little house, sells down a family, and keeps his gallery representation in New York, but he doesn't want to live there anymore. He wants to live, breathe, and be around his people, his surroundings, all the things that make him feel, at home. And he paints from Memphis for the rest of his career. This is the house that he builds over on South Greer Street. It was a kind of an abandoned farmhouse, and he kind of modernized it. And it's over, the funny thing about this house is, does anybody know where Greer Street is in Memphis? It's over by the Dixon. It's over by the country club. It is still kind of the art cultural area. It kind of grew up around Cloar, Another one of the reasons why Cloar became disenchanted with New York is the same fuse that helped perpetuate his career into the stratosphere, Life magazine, is a magazine about popularity and what's fad and what's cool. So guess what other American painter appears in Life magazine 2 years later. Jackson Pollock. And the line on the article reads, America's best painter, ? Nothing could be further than rural southern Arkansas cornball narrative than a Jackson Pollock. And baby, that's where New York was going. The abstract expressionist painters were everybody was buying them now. You know, MoMA was gobbling them up. It was the hip, cool thing. Peggy Guggenheim was representing Pollock for a while. And it became the next fad. And a lot of American scene painters, like CarrollCloar, like Thomas Hart Benton, said, you know, I'm going to go back to where my inspiration is, and I feel at home, and I don't want to look at another. Benton used to call them bug on the window paintings. But Cloar loved to absorb things. He loved to test things and kind of throw it into his mix and see if he could make it his own and see if he could spice up his own work. Does anybody know about the history of how this was created? This started off as a Jackson Pollock painting. He put his canvas down on the floor and he started splattering paint around, and you know, this was an abstract painting. And then he made a compositional drawing, but did it around the abstract elements that were happening in the paint. And he came up with this painting called Children Being Pursued by Hostile Butterflies, which is arguably one of his most famous paintings in his career. So he used other media and influence and ideas from other artists, and it made his work stronger. It made it have more depth. Two things about this painting. One, he has a preparatory drawing here, which at the Art Students League, he learned, as other artists do, to make preparatory drawings. So for every painting, there is an adjacent drawing. But the other thing is, what do you all think about the title, Children Being Pursued by Hostile Butterflies? What is that? What's he saying there? Well, a couple of things. About the same time, Hitchcock, of course, did a movie called The Birds. There's kind of that. But some people think, some people argue, some people propose that one of the things he's talking about is religious fundamentalism. Christ being the butterfly, the risen, who's pursuing these little children. Cloar had a lot of depth. Not only his personality and his character and his world travel, but when he came back to the South, one of the things that really kind of chapped him was fundamentalism. And the fact that fundamentalism usually had nothing to do with spirituality. It was about rules, it was about this, about that, you know, da-da-da-da-da. So he did about a dozen of these paintings that were kind of tongue-in-cheek, you know, kind of poking fun at you know, religious fundamentalism. And this was called Night Landscape. And if you've ever driven from Little Rock to Memphis, which I'm sure we all have, there's these wonderful signs saying, God is coming, be prepared. And this one says, Jesus saves, and it's got an arrow going this way, but look where the guys are walking. This is another piece that's kind of tongue-in-cheek. It's called The Broken Church from 1975, which is in this exhibition. And when we turn the lights up, please go look at it. It's a fantastic painting. But once again, he's saying that there's something in the South, in the Christian fundamentalism that's broken, that doesn't really connect, that it's not really feeding my soul. And he likes to kind of have these little social commentaries. Not like Ben Shahn, who is right in your face, you know, somebody killed, you know, a communist, and we need to be, you know, concerned about it. But a much more deeper, a much more subconscious kind of hey, take a look at this. And he also did this with the civil rights movement. I think this is arguably, in my mind, one of CarrollCloar's top paintings, definitely the top 5. I love this painting. It's in the permanent collection of the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, but there is something spooky and eerie about this painting. You know, in its coloration, you know, of course, what you got from Mexico, but also this little girl. You know, it reminds me of Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World. She's isolated, she's alone, she's at the foreground of the composition. And then what have we got going off way on the right-hand corner? It looks like Ku Klux Klan men, you know? Does anybody know what was going on in the 1960s in the United States? The civil rights movement, big time. You know, Martin Luther King had been arrested. They were having sit-ins. You know, blacks and whites couldn't eat at the same, you know, soda fountain together. Couldn't go to the same schools. And CarrollCloar, in a very delicate way, is showing us this, the horror in this, the something to be afraid of in this. And does anybody know what happens in 1964? Well, that, but also the Civil Rights Act gets signed into law by LBJ. So 4 years later, you know, we have this historic shift in the laws of the United States that say it's not okay to be segregated. You can't have whites in one restaurant and not have blacks, Mexicans, somebody of a different sexual persuasion. It was a sweeping civil rights bill. And how does CarrollCloar commemorate that? He does it very sly and elegant, and it has depth to it. This is called the historic encounter between E.H. Crum and W.C. Handy on Beale Street. You have some of the living legends of Memphis, Boss Crum, who built that town, you know, and W.C. Handy, who built the cultural, you know, fabric of that town, a white man and a black man. And then you've got this kind of interracial grouping of different important people from Memphis. And then you've got a black marching band behind there. And this whole painting is done in front of the Daisy Theater. Does everybody know where that is? And Stanton Thomas, who curated this exhibition that started at the Brooks and is now at the Arkansas Art Center, talked about how this is reminiscent of an Italian Renaissance painting where you've got the dome, the cupola, and you've got the Virgin Mary and Jesus. There's a lot going on in this painting. The next big shift for Cloar happens not by subject matter but by media. Around 1967, acrylics came onto the forefront. 1970 is coming, plastics. You remember The Graduate? You know, plastics. Acrylic is a plastic polymer paint. And Cloar becomes infatuated because it has very bright color. And more importantly, he doesn't have to screw around with egg yolks and milk protein. He can just wash it out right there in the sink and apply it at will. It dries fast. So CarrollCloar becomes an acrylic painter. This is a piece that we sold to Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art a couple years ago. It's in the Arkansas Art Center's collection. He's still got it though. Even though he switched from egg tempera to acrylic, he is still as tight as a pin. He is a precisionist. He knows how to paint. When you see this picture in the flesh, either at AAC or at Crystal Bridges, take a look at it. The detail is incredible. Every blade of grass is represented. And through the 1970s, he is really hitting his stride. I think there's three distinct eras, but you know, 1950s, 16s casein has its own look and feel, and then the 1970s with the acrylic has its own look and feel. And he's still very much sought after, very important painter, still being gobbled up by people in New York, but he starts selling out of his studio in Memphis. So as the years go by in the 1980s, two things happen. A, he's getting older in age, you know. He's still a workhorse, just like Thomas Hart Benton He would clock in at 8 o'clock in the morning, paint for 4 hours, go have lunch, come back at 1 and paint until 6, and then have a cocktail with his wife every single day. But he's getting older. He's approaching 70. And the colors are not as vibrant. The details not as as rich. Things are a little bit fuzzy. But more importantly, CarrollCloar contracts cancer and finds out about it in about 1987. And this is a piece from 1988. He still got it, and this is, of course, in the exhibition right here. I think this is a fantastic painting. But in the early 90s, he's still painting, and he's still there every day. He's still doing it, but he's starting to. Not that there's anything wrong with this, but he's starting to trade in a little pointillism and all the detail for big swaths of color. He just doesn't have the energy anymore. So this piece, Street Scene in Mark Tree, which is also in our exhibition, a great painting, but a very different painting. A painting, I would say, that is going back to the beginning of his career, where the figures almost become cartoon-like, where the colors are flatter, where there's buildings and narrative scene. Here's a woman buying some material to make a dress from a shopkeeper in Mark Tree, Arkansas. So in 1993, CarrollCloar is 80 years old and makes a decision to take his own life rather than be a burden to his lovely wife, Pat. And, he was an artist. He came into this world, a cowboy and a rebel, and he went out the same way. And there's not another painter that I know of that has captured the people, the landscape, the social fabric, the narrative in such a way as CarrollCloar has in the United States. I love his art. I love his take on life and the corny, goofball kind of narrative things, where you've got, somebody in front of a water tower. You've got a whole bunch of, African Americans that are going to go on a Sunday joyride, So I would say that CarrollCloar is, without a doubt, Arkansas's most important painter, and also Tennessee's as well. And we were thrilled that the Brooks Museum pulled together the retrospective and has toured it. There's a new book out. And thank you all so much for coming.